Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the Quantitative Results chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to present this information in case you're interested in support outside of this webinar. So we do provide assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. And just to give an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, so this webinar is on the components of the quantitative results chapter. So we will not be discussing qualitative results today. We do have a separate webinar series that covers qualitative results. And first, we'll talk about the purpose of the results chapter and the importance of the results chapter for the dissertation. And then the bulk of the discussion is going to be on the different components that are required for the results chapter. So this includes discussions of the introduction, data collection and preparation, descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, your testing of the research questions, and the summary. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So once the presentation is over, you can enter your questions into the questions section, and we will take some time after we go through the presentation to answer any questions that you may have. So first, let's talk about the purpose of the results chapter and why it's important to the dissertation. So the results chapter is meant to present the data and the analyses that you conducted to answer the research questions and hypotheses for your study. So the previous chapters of the dissertation covered the why and how of your dissertation. So your introduction and literature review essentially covers why you're doing your research. Your methodology chapter covers how you're doing your research. And once you get to the results, you're discussing what you actually found after you conducted the research. And so in the results chapter, you want to be able to present the findings for each research question and hypothesis with a clear statement that answers each of those. So by the end of your results chapter, you should have a definitive answer to each research question or a definitive statement that addresses each hypothesis. So for instance, whether the hypothesis was supported or not supported. But you want to save further interpretation for the discussion chapter. So the results chapter really shouldn't go beyond answering the research questions and hypotheses. You shouldn't begin to talk about how the results relate to the literature or tie in other literature to your results until you get to the discussion chapter. And it's important to note that although we will be talking about the components that are most typical for the quantitative results chapter based on our experience with many different schools, you do want to defer to your specific school's guidelines and requirements for what needs to go into the results chapter, because this may be slightly different for each school. So some schools may require more sections, some schools may require different sections than what we present here. Sometimes they want the information in different sections than we outline here. So you want to make sure that you always follow the specific guidelines outlined by your school or your degree program. So now let's get into the components of the results chapter, starting with the introduction. So most chapters of the dissertation will start with a very short introduction that just reorients the reader to the purpose of the study and goes over what the chapter will cover. So you'll want to start the introduction by restating your purpose or problem statement. And this can be a verbatim restatement of the purpose or problem, or it can be an abbreviated version of your purpose statement. And you also want to restate your research questions and hypotheses. When you restate your research questions and hypotheses, these should be stated verbatim each time they appear in your document. So the wording of the research questions and hypotheses should never change throughout your document. It should be worded exactly the same each time they appear. And then you can simply outline the contents of the results chapter by listing out the different sections that will appear in the chapter. And you may want to start your results chapter by talking about the data collection and preparation. So you'll want to summarize the data collection procedures that you conducted and note any changes from your originally proposed procedures. And this is especially important if you do have to change in your results something that you propose to do in your proposal phase. So it is sometimes the case that when you do your dissertation proposal, you'll propose a certain method of data collection or certain data collection procedures. But when you actually go to conduct your study, things may not always work out as planned. You may run into some issue that causes you to have to change what you actually do for your data collection procedures. So maybe you couldn't recruit participants from the exact sample frame that you planned to, or maybe the archival data that you plan to use didn't have some of the variables available that you were originally planning to look at. So whatever the case may be, if you had to change any aspect of your data collection procedures, or if anything was different from what you originally proposed, you're going to want to outline what those changes were. Your school may have different requirements for how exactly you go about doing this. Some schools may require you to actually go back to your methodology chapter and change your methodology chapter to reflect what you actually did compared to what you originally planned to do. Other schools will want you to keep your methodology chapter the same, so your methodology will still discuss what you originally planned to do, and then they want you to explain what was different in your results chapter. So again, you'll want to check your school's specific requirements about reporting those changes. So after you've talked about the data collection procedures and how they were actually carried out, you'll want to discuss your sample and the response rate and attrition. So for instance, if you're doing a survey study, you'll want to talk about how many total survey responses you received. You'll want to talk about then any attrition or any reasons you may have to exclude certain responses. So maybe some participants didn't meet your eligibility criteria, or maybe participants were missing, some participants were missing too much data to include them in the sample. So whatever the reason may be that you might have to exclude responses, you'll want to report that. So you'll want to say how many responses you excluded and for what reasons you excluded any responses. You'll want to report the final total sample size after you account for all of the exclusions or attrition. And then it may be necessary for you to conduct a post hoc power analysis if your target sample size isn't met. And this again will depend on your specific school's requirements. Some schools will require you to do a post hoc power analysis if you don't meet your original target sample size. Some schools will only require you to do a post hoc power analysis if the results of your analyses aren't statistically significant. And then, some other schools may not even require you to do a post hoc power analysis at all. So you'll want to check your specific school's guidelines in terms of what they require there. But We won't go into a whole lot of detail about how to conduct a post hoc power analysis in this presentation because we do have other webinars that are specifically dedicated to power analysis. So if you're interested in more information on that topic, I'd refer you to those specific webinars. And then after you discuss the responses, you'll want to talk about the preliminary data preparation steps that you took to clean up the data, get it ready for the analysis. So this can involve things like checking the data for accuracy, how you handle missing data, and checking for things like outliers. So checking the data for accuracy is especially important if you had, for instance, paper and pencil surveys that you had to manually enter into an electronic format. You'll want to check those data entries to make sure that the data were entered correctly from the paper and pencil responses to the electronic format. You'll also want to discuss in detail how you're handling any missing data. So it's very likely that when you collect your data that you'll have some missing responses or some missing values in your data set. So you'll want to discuss very specifically how you're going to handle those. So are you going to just exclude any participants who are missing any responses and only include people who provided full responses? Or are you going to exclude people who are missing a certain percentage of their responses? Or are you going to try to include people who are missing some responses and then replace those missing responses in some way? And if so, how are you going to do that? So are you going to use some sort of an imputation or a mean replacement? You want to be very specific in terms of describing how you're handling the missing responses. Another thing you may want to talk about is how you code or recode any data or compute scores for variables. So if you're using a survey instrument, for instance, maybe there are negatively worded items in the instrument that need to be reverse coded before you can use them in the analysis. And maybe you're taking a set of multiple items and combining them into a composite score for your variables of interest. So you'll want to describe that process in as much detail as possible. So now let's take a look at some examples of how you might write up this portion of the results section. So here we just have an example of a short excerpt where we talk about first the total number of survey responses that were received. We talk about how we removed participants who didn't complete a certain percentage of the survey. We then state the sample size after we excluded those people, and then we talk about how we're going to handle any additional missing responses in the data. Here's another excerpt that provides a little bit more detail about the data collection. Again, we talk about the total number of participants that responded to the survey. We talk about specifically how many participants we excluded and for what reasons. And then we report our final total sample size. And then here's just an example of how you might write up the results of a post hoc power analysis in case you need to do that. So we state that we need to conduct a post hoc power analysis. We state what statistical analyses we are doing the post hoc power analysis for. We state our sample size, and we state the power that we achieved with that analysis given the sample size. So now let's talk about the preliminary demographics and descriptive statistics. So before you get into the analysis of your research questions, you'll probably want to present descriptive statistics to characterize your sample and to provide descriptives for your variables of interest. So you may want to provide descriptive statistics for any demographic information you collected, because that will give information about the representativeness of your sample in relation to the population, and then descriptives for the main variables of interest in your study. So in other words, the variables that are outlined in your research questions and hypotheses. So you may want to report frequencies and percentages for categorical variables. So this can include things like gender and ethnicity. And you can report statistics such as means and standard deviations for continuous variables. So this might be something like age in years or GPA. If possible, you may want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to the population. So again, this goes back to establishing the representativeness of your sample. If you have information about population characteristics, so for instance, what is the proportion of males and females in the population, you can then compare that to the proportion of males and females that you observed in your sample to see if it's similar or different. And if applicable, you may need to present reliability coefficients, which is often just Cronbach's alpha coefficients for any survey instruments or applicable measures that you're using. So if you're using a survey instrument that consists of multiple items that are composited together to form some kind of score for a variable, then you may need to run a reliability analysis on those items to ensure that they are reliable in your sample. Now let's take a look at some examples of how you might present the descriptive statistics. So here we have an example of how we might present descriptives for some categorical variables. So we have a table presenting frequencies and percentages for each of the categories. And we also have some narrative explanation to summarize these descriptive statistics. It's important to note that when you're presenting anything in your results, if you're presenting something in a table, you want to make sure that you first always refer to that table in the text. So you should never have a table standing on its own without introducing or referring to it in the text. So we see here, we say that results are displayed in table 1. And you also want to make sure that the table appears in proximity to where you refer to it in the text. This usually means you present the table in after the paragraph where the reference to the table first appears. So you probably don't want to introduce a table and then present the table 5 pages later. You want to make sure that your table is presented in proximity to where you refer to it in the text. And here's another example of a table for how you might present descriptive statistics for continuous variables. So we have information about the minimum and maximum values, as well as the mean and the standard deviation. And here's how you might present results for reliability statistics or Cronbach's alpha. So you can present on the number of items in the scale and the Cronbach's alpha coefficient associated with that scale. Now let's talk about assumptions testing. So assumption testing is an important part of your presentation of the results. Before you can interpret the results of your statistical analyses and answer your research questions, you have to ensure that the assumptions of those statistical analyses are met. And so typically you will present the results of the assumptions test for each of the statistical analyses that you are conducting. And these may be presented in their own dedicated section prior to the results of the analysis, or they can be presented alongside each analysis. So maybe you will present the assumption test for your research question 1 analysis, and then your results for research question 1, and so on. And again, you may want to refer to your specific school guidelines to see how exactly they want you to present the assumptions testing. But generally, the information you will want to include is first, how you're testing each assumption. You'll also want to include the result of that test. You'll want to make a clear statement of whether or not the assumption was met. And then if the assumption was not met, you will want to describe the action that you took to account for the fact that the assumption was not met. So for instance, if you're doing something like an independent samples t-test, one of the assumptions that you might have to test is normality. So first, you want to talk about how you are testing that assumption. So how are you going to ensure that the data are normally distributed? Are you going to look at a histogram or a QQ plot? Or are you going to look at things like skewness and kurtosis values? Or are you going to use an inferential test like a Shapiro-Wilk test? Or are you going to use a combination of those things? So you want to say specifically how you're testing that assumption. Then you'll want to describe the results of those tests. So, when you look at the histograms, what do you see in the histograms? And have you determined if the data are normally distributed or not? You'll want to say whether the assumption is met or not. So based on what you saw in your tests for normality, does normality appear to be met or is it not met? And then if normality was not met, what are you going to do about it? So are you going to do some kind of data transformation to make the data normal? Or are you going to do an alternative test, such as a non-parametric test, that doesn't require the normality assumption? So you'll want to do that for each assumption for each statistical test that you are conducting. So now let's look at some examples of how you might write up the results of assumptions testing. So here we are doing a test for normality using a PP plot. So here we describe how we're testing normality. We make a statement of interpretation of our PP plot. We say that there was not significant deviation from normal. And we state that the assumption was met. Now here's an example of when an assumption is not met. So we talk about some assumptions here, say how we're testing these assumptions. We state whether or not the assumptions appear to be met. In this case, we talk about outliers. We say how we're testing for outliers. We say that we did detect an outlier. And then we talk about how we're going to account for this outlier. We say in this case that the outlier was excluded from our analysis. And once you have covered all of the assumptions for your tests, you can then get into the main part of the results chapter, which is the analysis of the research questions and hypotheses. So you'll want to present the results of each analysis that you conduct to answer each research question and hypothesis. And generally, you'll want to organize this section by the order of your research questions and hypotheses. So you want to start with research question 1 or hypothesis 1, then go in order, research question 1, then research question 2, and so on. You don't want to really jump around and do things out of order from the way your research questions are presented in your paper. So you don't want to start with research question 2 and then jump to research question 5 and then go back to research question 1. You want to present things in a very clear and organized way. And similar to the data collection procedures, if anything had to change in your analysis procedures from what you originally proposed in your methodology chapter, you will want to discuss those changes. So in your methodology chapter, it's likely that you established a data analysis plan where you wrote up what analyses you plan to do to answer your research questions, But again, once you actually conduct the research, sometimes things can change. You may run into issues that prevent you from doing the analyses exactly as you proposed originally. So if that's the case and you had to make changes and run a different type of analysis than you originally proposed, you'll want to both explain what those changes were and justify those changes. So provide rationale for why the change was needed and justify the use of a different analysis. So you'll want to clearly identify the variables that you're using in each analysis. So for instance, if you're doing something like a t-test or an ANOVA, you'll want to clearly indicate what the independent and dependent variables are for those analyses. If you're doing something like a regression, you want to clearly state what your predictor and criterion variables are. And also, if you have any covariates in your analysis, you'll want to list what those are. You'll want to report the appropriate statistics associated with each test. So things like p-values, effect sizes, and confidence intervals. So if you're doing something like a t-test, you may want to report your t-values, degrees of freedom, the p-values, and effect size like Cohen's d for that t-test. And we'll get to examples of that in just a moment. And then if your analysis requires post hoc testing, such as if you're running an ANOVA and the ANOVA was significant, you may need to do post hoc tests on that. So if that applies to your analysis, you want to report the results of that post hoc testing. And very importantly, you want to include a clear statement that answers each research question or hypothesis based on the results of the analysis. So you'll want to be able to present the results of the analysis, make an interpretation of those results, and be able to answer your research question or hypothesis very clearly. If your hypotheses are written in null and alternative format, this often means stating it such as the null hypothesis was rejected if your results were statistically significant, or the null hypothesis was not rejected, or you failed to reject the null hypothesis if your results were not statistically significant. So now let's go ahead and look at some examples of how you might write up some results. So here is an example of how you might write up the results for an independent samples t-test. So we start by saying what analysis we're conducting. We state our independent and dependent variables, and we present the results of our t-test. So the appropriate statistics for the t-test would be our t-statistic with our degrees of freedom for the test in parentheses, our p-value, and our effect size, Cohen's d. And in this case, our p-value is not less than 0.05. So that would indicate that there are not differences in the scores, and we fail to reject our null hypothesis. So we make a clear statement of that saying the null hypothesis was not rejected. And then you may have a table displaying relevant statistics for that test. So for instance, with the t-test, you might show the means for each of the groups that you are comparing. Now here's an example of a t-test that was actually significant. So again, we start by saying what test we're conducting. We establish what our independent and dependent variables are. And then we present the results of the t-test. In this case, our p-value is less than 0.05, so it is significant. It indicates that there are differences between the groups. And we make a clear statement in regards to our hypothesis. We showed significant differences, so in this case, we reject the null hypothesis. Now here's an example of how you might report the results of a one-way ANOVA, or analysis of variance. So again, we start by saying what analysis we're conducting and what our independent and dependent variables are. we present the results of our ANOVA. So in this case, similar to the t-test, we present our F statistic instead of the t statistic. But for an F-test, we'll always have 2 degrees of freedom in the parentheses. So the first number will be our numerator degrees of freedom. And the second number will be our denominator or error degrees of freedom. So we present that, our F statistic, our p-value, which in this case is greater than 0.05. So it suggests that our results are not significant. And so we do not reject the null hypothesis. And again, we might present a table showing, for instance, the means of the different groups that we are comparing. Now here's an example of how you might write up a correlational analysis. So here we are reporting the results of some Pearson correlations. Here we actually restate our research question. We say that we're conducting a Pearson correlation, and we state what our variables are. We then report the results of the correlations. So we report our correlation coefficients R, as well as the p-values associated with those correlations. And we see that we do have significant correlations here. We have p-values less than 0.05. And so we can reject our null hypothesis. And here is just kind of an excerpt of a table that you might present that presents the Pearson correlation coefficients. Now here's an example of results for a regression analysis. So you might start by presenting the results for your overall regression model, which would include the results of an F-test, your p-value, as well as perhaps your R-squared value or variance explained for your regression. In this case, our p-value for our overall regression is less than 0.05, so it's significant, and we can reject our null hypothesis. And then if your regression is significant, you'll probably want to discuss the significance of the individual predictors in the regression. So you might present those in a table like we see here, and then discuss which predictors in the regression were significant. So in this case, we see that sex is a significant predictor of our criterion variable. And now I'll just show you how you might produce some results in our Intellectus statistics software. So if you're trying to decide which software you might want to use for your analysis, you may want to consider using something like Intellectus statistics, which can actually help you with your results write-up. So here, if we want to do, for instance, a simple regression, we can choose a linear regression. We just need to enter in our dependent and independent variables. So we can select, for instance, a dependent variable, and then select some independent or predictor variables that we want to use to predict that outcome. And then we can calculate that analysis. And in our Intellectus statistics software, you actually see that it will give you some narrative explanation, first of our assumptions testing. So we see we test the assumptions of normality and homoscedasticity, multicollinearity, and outliers. So we provide some narrative explanation of those assumptions as well as figures for those tests. And then it presents the results of our analysis. So it gives us the results of our overall regression model, as well as a table showing our individual regression coefficients. So this is just an example of output that you may get when you use the Intellectus software and how it can really help you with drafting your results section. And then the final section of the results chapter is typically a summary of the results. So here you just want to summarize either the chapter contents completely or just the findings to address the research questions. So here you'll want to restate the answer to each research question and hypothesis. So again, state whether each hypothesis was supported or not supported, or the null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected, and kind of give a summary explanation of how you arrived at each of those conclusions. And then finally, you want to provide just a short transitioning statement, a sentence or two to your discussion chapter. And so that brings us to the end of our presentation on the components of the quantitative results chapter. Again, if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of this webinar, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. But now I'll go ahead and answer any questions that you may have. So if you do have questions, you may go ahead and enter those into the question section now, and I'll do my best to answer your questions. I'm going to check now and see what questions we may have here already. So one question is, I've done a regression, however, I'm still confused if I need to do a test for normality, as some people only do it for comparative tests. So for a regression, typically what you would test for is the normality of the regression residuals. Rather than a comparative test may test the normality of the variables themselves. But if you're doing a regression, we're mainly concerned with whether the residuals of the regression are normally distributed. And you can test that a number of different ways. So in a lot of software packages, it will automatically produce or you have the option to produce something like a normal PP plot of the residuals, which will show you if data are normally distributed. So if we go back to our example in our Intellectus software, we can actually see that this analysis produced a QQ scatter plot of our residuals that we can use to assess for normality. Or you can calculate the residuals from the analysis and produce something like a histogram of those residuals, or the skewness and kurtosis values of those residuals, or even conduct a Shapiro-Wilk test on those residuals to see if they match a normal distribution. So there are any number of ways that you can test that. But for a regression, the thing that you'll actually want to test is the normality of the residuals. And just as a note, also on that issue, we do have other webinars that specifically cover normality tests. So if you are more interested in that topic, then I would refer you to our past webinars where we have covered how to test for normality. And it looks like those are the only questions entered so far. So if anyone has any other questions, feel free to enter those questions now. Okay, it doesn't look like any other questions are being submitted, so I'm going to go ahead and end our webinar here for today. Again, if you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar, you can use the information you see on the screen now to contact us and uh, get more help, or you can refer to our webinars on other topics in case you're interested in information um, on other topics as well. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. I hope everyone found this presentation useful, and I hope everyone has a great day.